Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Often we laugh at seemingly disparate things coming together in surprising ways as a relief from the stresses and vagaries of life. My favorite cartoonist is Roz Chast, and I have a lot of her books, and they're right on the shelf right next to Dogen Zenji. I attended a Shuso ceremony, a special ceremony at the Berkeley Zen Center. Lori Sanaki was the Shuso at that time. And during the question and answer period, one of the students said to Lori, "I've read in the paper that Buddhists are happier than other people tend to be. What do you say about that?" And Lori thought for a moment and she said, "You know, we're always the last to know." Josh Kornbluth has been a solo performer in the Bay Area for many years. I hope you've had a chance to see Josh perform. Right now, he's an artist in residence at the Memory and Aging Clinic at UCSF. And he asked one of the neurologists there what we can do to deepen our empathy with one another. Josh came up with this project because as artist in residence, you have to have a project. And his rather modest project is to start a worldwide revolution in empathy. No stress there, right? And he wants to look at this, deepening our empathy at this time in our country when there's such huge divisions and really rampant hatred and judgment and prejudice running rampant in our country. And he was told that if a person who has deep prejudice against someone of a particular race or religion, if someone holds that deep prejudice and yet has a kind of transformative experience with someone of that race or religion, this can light a spark of empathy within themselves. I'm sure, as I have, you've heard stories of former gang members or white nationalists who've been transformed by the power of love just through connection with another individual, that led them to disavow their violence and hatred. Well, when Josh asked this question of a very renowned neurologist, she said that storytelling is central to being human. And that we transform one another by listening to one another's stories. When I hear your story, my brain is literally changed. The neurons in my brain make way to include you. They make a path for you in my brain. As you speak, your image is literally in my eyes, and your voice is in my ears. And by the same token, when you hear my story, you are changed. So when we listen to one another with an open heart and mind, we are transformed. And this is an invitation for us all to listen to one another's stories with open hearts and minds. And of course, often our stories spark humor and empathy. I love stories from every tradition. And there are a lot of funny, quirky stories in the Zen tradition. Here's a story that I heard when I was very new to practice. I didn't know quite what to make of the story at the time, but it's come up for me at different times in my life when I needed it. Two monks were walking through the forest, and they came to a stream, and there was a young woman standing on the edge of that stream, holding up her robe a little bit, not sure how to get across. Well, one of these monks spontaneously offered to carry her across, and she jumped on his back, piggyback style, and the three of them waded across the stream. And on the other side, the monk who was carrying the young woman gently let her down to the ground, and she went off on her direction, and the two monks continued. Well, after the monks had been walking towards their home temple in silence, one of the monks said to the other one, "I can't believe that you broke your vow and carried that woman across the stream." And the other monk said, "Well, I put her down about an hour ago, but you've been carrying her all this way." Now, if my teacher had said to me, "Don't waste your time judging other people's practice," I don't think that lesson would have stayed with me the way this story has. You know, our precepts are not carved in stone. We can have a dynamic and spontaneous response to the events in our lives and try to respond in an appropriate way. You know, that one monk responded in an appropriate way. I think that having a sense of humor and being able to laugh at ourselves, most importantly, the vicissitudes of life, if we can laugh at the vicissitudes of life, it's kind of a buffer, really a kind of wonderful, warm detachment from the world. The great American Zen master Mel Brooks said, "Humor has been my delicious refuge from the world." Humor has been my delicious refuge from the world. We lost the Queen of England not long ago, and even the Queen had her rough days. I remember several years ago, she would always give a New Year's address to her country. And several years ago, part of her palace burned down, and her adult children were misbehaving in the tabloids. And in her annual New Year's speech to the nation, she said, with characteristic British understatement, she looked back on the year and said, "It is not a year upon which I will look back with undiluted joy." I've had years like that, you know. Suzuki Roshi's students said he was a powerful presence. He was only 4'11" tall. He could be harsh and demanding, but also very playful and childlike. And if you get to hear his lectures, he laughed a lot. I heard that at the beginning of a sesshin, you know, a 7-day meditation, he looked at his students and he said, "The problems you are having now are the problems you will have for the rest of your life." And he tilted his head back and laughed. One day a student asked Suzuki Roshi, he said, "Roshi, I have a lot of sexual desire. I'm thinking of becoming celibate. Should I try to limit myself in this way?" And Suzuki answered, "Sex is like brushing your teeth. It's a good thing to do, but not so good to do it all day long." And Dogen Zenji himself might have had a pretty good sense of humor. He referred to life as one continuous mistake. So I want to share with you some things that, you know, this is not based so much on scientific research, but some things that come to my mind, some positive aspects of cultivating humor. One thing is that everything is changing, so we might as well laugh. One of our invitations to lighten up and have a sense of humor is that everything is constantly shifting and changing. Whatever we're upset about today may very well be completely different tomorrow. David Chadwick, a Zen priest at Zen Center and the author of Suzuki Roshi's wonderful biography, which is called Crooked Cucumber. That was Suzuki Roshi's nickname given to him by his teacher, Crooked Cucumber. David Chadwick asked Suzuki Roshi, he said, "If you could sum up Buddhism in one phrase, what would it be?" And Suzuki Roshi answered without hesitation, "Everything changes." Well, I would have to add, except Jason Bateman. I don't know if you've noticed, he never changes. Humor conveys our affection for and our connection with one another. Sometimes you meet someone and you immediately know through their sense of humor that you have an affinity. With old friends, we remember stories from the past that made us laugh. My daughter, Nova, who has a wonderful sense of humor, she and I have been through a lot together, and she's 42 years old now. She's a wonderful preschool teacher in Oakland. And I recently came across a Mother's Day card that Nova gave me a couple of years ago. On the front, it said, "I got born, I grew up, I left home, I got a job, I'm not in prison." And on the inside, it said, "What more could a mother want?" Humor can transform an argument and help you and someone you love remember shared bonds. You know, sometimes we have a moment, and I think practice gives us this moment when we can pause and notice that we have a choice. We can be righteously indignant and get puffed up and angry, or we can find something in a situation to laugh at, or a shared memory that can melt all animosity. I noticed in my 35 years of teaching third grade, I retired a couple of years ago, I noticed that one of my students would do something like, they love to poke me with a finger to get my attention. I really hated that. And I would say, that is pet peeve number 1427. I treasure many shared moments I had with my third graders. I was out at Point Reyes not long ago, and this young woman walked up to me and she said, "Laura, I don't know if you remember me. I'm Anna. I was in your class." And I said, "Anna, not only do I remember you, I remember when you raised your hand and said, 'Laura, what happens after you die? I forget.'" I had a bell in my class that I would ring, and we'd take 3 deep breaths. The kids called it the peace bell. We'd just take 3 breaths. And sometimes when the kids were kind of rowdy or just settling down, I would sit in my chair when we were gathering in the meeting area, and I'd just close my eyes and follow my breath after I rang that bell. And one day I heard Hannah in my class say, "Quiet, you guys, Laura's in her secret happy place." Humor can point to a larger truth. When I taught kids, I used to remind myself now and then to stop being surprised when third graders act like third graders. And that would also lead me to not be surprised when people act like people. My friend James says, "People, they're not what they're cracked up to be." Sometimes things are so bad, all you can do is laugh. Around Day of the Dead, I would ask my students to remember a person or a pet who died. And often third graders by that time had a grandparent who died, or a lot of them had pets who died. And so we would go around the circle and share about our pets or our grandparents. And Chris Chris told us this story one day. She said, "I came home from soccer practice one day and all my pets had died." And I said, "Chris, what happened?" And she said, "Well, I like to let my hamster run around free in my bedroom. And one day my hamster got up on my bunk bed and fell or jumped down into my fishbowl. And my hamster drowned in the fishbowl and all my fish fell out and died on the floor." Well, when she told us this story, we were just stunned, and then one of the kids started to laugh a little bit. And then Chris started to laugh a little bit, and I laughed, and I said, we shouldn't feel bad about laughing about this, Chris. sometimes things are just so bad, all you can do is laugh. And if they'd been a little bit older, I might have shared a wonderful quote by by Samuel Beckett, who said, "When you're up to your neck in shit, there's nothing for it but to sing." What can you do sometimes? Humor is often based on making connections between seemingly unconnected things. Humor can take us by surprise. Maybe that's the at the core of humor. One day I was walking in the hallway behind a couple of my students, and I heard Talia. I don't know why they were talking about death, but Talia said to Tess, "Would you rather be buried or cremated?" And Tess said, "I don't know, surprise me." It's funny how I stopped teaching kids 2 years ago, but I'm still using their material. Self-deprecating humor has its place as well. We find humility when we don't take ourselves so seriously. I knew a woman who was practicing with humility, and she found herself looking around the room and thinking, "I have more humility than anybody in this room." And she was wise enough, to laugh at herself when she found herself thinking that. I think this self-deprecating humor can help us cultivate a warm detachment towards the world. Through practice, we can catch ourselves being self-righteous, and we can feel a little bit silly. Maybe part of humility is having a sense of humor, even about our own shortcomings. We can stop expecting ourselves to be perfect. And I think part of our practice is to, we talk about right speech in Buddhism, and part of our practice is to notice and apprehend the way we talk to ourselves. We might have this ongoing negative, judgmental voice in our head that's trained on our every action, and chastising for ourselves for our mistakes. And I think we can transform this self-judgment into kind of a loving friend, a loving witness who will always be there for us, even when we're not at our best. Another wonderful thing about humor, I'm sure you're aware of, is that it relieves stress. Studies show that humor has impressive health benefits because laughter it releases endorphins and the bonding chemical oxytocin. Laughter decreases the stress hormone cortisol, the stress hormone. So shared laughter brings strangers, co-workers, intimate partners, and family members closer together, and it also reduces our individual stress. Humor isn't necessarily benign. In fact, it can be quite aggressive. You've heard a comedian who did well say they killed or they destroyed. And if they don't do well, they say they died or they bombed. I've listened to comics talk about their craft, and many of them were painfully shy as kids or developed humor as a defense. They talk about using humor to make a depressed parent laugh or to distract a bully on the playground when they were young. Maybe you did that yourself. Chris Rock has talked about that. He said he was too skinny and small as a kid to fight, so he had to be funny. And I've always loved and admired the humor and irreverence in gay culture, a kind of protection from and a noble answer to small minds. Not to brag, but my mother was good friends with Truman Capote in high school. And she said that you never wanted to leave the room when Truman was talking because you didn't know what he might say about you when you weren't in the room. But she loved him and his irreverent sense of humor. And, she said he was always out. he was never in the closet. Truman was out, from the time he was born. I grew up in a household where there was a lot of teasing, and I learned to give as good as I got. One of the best compliments you could get at our dinner table was if someone teased you and you came back with a zinger. My dad would say, "Good comeback." Sometimes, though, I don't look forward to seeing someone because their default position is to mock me. They might start off our conversation with some barbed comment. And the literal meaning of the word sarcasm is to rip the flesh. We can use humor at someone else's expense. I've certainly teased others or said something glib that I immediately wished I could retrieve. I love the expression, "I would have bit my tongue if my foot hadn't been in my mouth." I notice, though, that I don't tease people that I don't already feel comfortable with. But I still think it's worth asking when teasing is genuine affection and when it is disguised hostility. Of course, we should practice diligently as if to save our heads from fire. But I do hope we can bring some silliness and generosity and humor to the path of practice and recovery. When my daughter Nova was a teenager, she walked through the living room one day. I had some of Pema Chodron's books spread out on the coffee table. Going to the places that scare you, No Time to Lose, When Things Fall Apart, The Wisdom of No Escape. And Nova looked at those book covers and said, "Geez, what a drama queen." My editor at Shambhala was filming Pema in Nova Scotia a few months ago, and I told Ivan that story, and he said he would tell Pema that story, and I think she has a sense of humor. I think she would enjoy that. Humor is so important to help us stop taking ourselves so seriously and taking our opinions so seriously. That's just an epidemic of very serious opinions right now across the country. Again, this is a form of detachment, not a cold detachment or a cynical detachment, not a refusal to engage in the world, but a warm-hearted detachment that comes from the truth of recognizing the truth of impermanence, understanding that the difficulties we're experiencing, the dark time we're going through is just another part of the path and will pass away like everything else. This too shall pass. So let's remember the words of Tendo Nyojo. "I've given you my all, tossing it your way with a hearty laugh. I entrust it all to the spring wind, for there is nothing more I need to do." I'd like to ask you now just to assume your meditation posture. I'm going to ask you to sit quietly in your Zazen posture. That's good. Your Zazen posture for a few minutes, and just come back to your breath. It's a helpful practice to think of humor in terms of right speech. So as we sit in this ancient posture, I'd like to ask you to ask yourself a few questions as a kind of reflection on the talk I've shared with you today. I'll ask each question and then ask you to reflect on it. Am I using humor to mock and belittle? Am I using humor to keep people at a distance or to disguise my real feelings or who I really am? Do I use humor when I honestly don't even know how I really feel? Do I use humor to connect joyfully with others? To diffuse a tense situation? To relieve stress and make a connection? Am I using humor to build bonds of affection and identification? Is humor a reflection of joy and love and delight at this crazy reality we find ourselves in? Or do I sometimes use it to shame and diminish? How can I use humor in a wholesome way? Can I find humor and at the same time avoid doing harm? Thank you so much for your kind attention, and we have some time now for discussion or reflection, so I'd love to hear what might have come up for you around this topic of humor. I think it will help if you can, if you're on Zoom and you can, you know, click onto the raise hand function on your reactions button on the bottom of your screen. I'm going to ask Jim, though, to call on people, if you could, Jim, because I know there are people there who may like to raise their hand and contribute to the discussion. So the floor is open.
I need to see people's hands.
Whether you're at home on Zoom or in the room.
Anyone got their hand up that I can't see? Speak up.
Here, Jim.
Okay. David.
I don't know, some of you know me for a long time, and you know that I sometimes am a controversial person. But one thing came up recently about what do you want on your headstone for people to think about you because you get the last word. And I think it's very helpful to think about that because you get to have your last word if you pick that. And I came up with this statement. He meant well.
That's good.
Who else?
I understand Johnny Carson wanted on his headstone, he wanted it to be, "I'll be right back."
Chris has his hands up.
Chris.
Hi. One of my teachers I had at of Vipassana teachers at Spirit Rock had ordained, and he was in Burma, and he was there for about a year. And they would ride a big cart into town. All the monks would pile on a cart, and then they would pick up people on the way to town. And at one point during one travel, a bunch of women got on that were townspeople, got on and sat behind them, and one leaned on his back. And he couldn't escape it. He was very warm. He said it was a very big back. He said he just kept, and he was getting very aroused. And he said every movement he did, he would move forward and back, and she would move with him. And it just went on for like a half an hour. And he was getting very aroused. He was saying, God, and he'd have to kind of confess it to the other monks during their monthly confession. And after about a half an hour of this and a lot of sweating, the wind finally jumped off, and he turned around and realized it was a sack of potatoes that was leaning against him. I thought that was pretty good. You know, Laura, you brought something up which is so true to me, and I'm sure a lot of other folks in our group have the similar experience. I was like the class clown. When the bullies would start to act up and act out on me, like in 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, I learned a lot of quickly dancing around and dodging it. Of course, I was probably, you know, jump roping with my girlfriends or playing hopscotch, so I was kind of a sitting target for it. But I really learned to dance around and add a lot of humor to the situation. So in a way, I would befriend them. It was a way I could diffuse it. But I also carried that through into my adulthood, and I realized there was a lot of fear behind that humor. And so I'm just wondering, as an elementary school teacher for the years you had, when you see that happening with your students, you know, that the class clown and or the bullying, how did you attend to it, or how did you reach out to that young child to make them feel better? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, one thing that really pained me as a teacher was when it got to be fashionable for kids to throw around the word gay. You know, they'd say, "Oh, that's so gay," or "You're gay." And whenever that would happen, I would stop everything and I'd say, "I just heard someone use the word gay as a kind of insult. I'd like you to raise your hand if you love someone who's gay." And I would raise my hand. My daughter's gay. And everybody in the class would raise their hand. I went to a school where there were a lot of gay families. And, you know, that was one way to just stop everything and talk about it. Also, you know, kids experiment a lot with humor, and they experiment a lot in their social realms. And, you know, Chris, I was really careful not to shame a kid who was experimenting in that way, but to stop it and talk about it, rather than shaming the person that was using humor in an inappropriate way. I had a boy in my class who was the first child he was the other kids in our class had identified themselves as gay. My school went from preschool to 8th grade. But Gordon identified himself when he was in 4th grade as gay. And when he was in 3rd grade, I took him aside, you know, and I said, "Gordon, you know, you're so emotional and so dramatic. And I was that way when I was young, and I loved theater. When I did community theater when I was your age, I took drama classes, was in a lot of plays in high school. And then I majored in drama in college. I always wanted to be an actress when I grew up. And you might find theater really a wonderful outlet for yourself. I always loved theater." And he looked at me and he said, "So Laura, what made you abandon your dreams?" So I think he was sticking the knife in a little bit, but I said to him, "You know, Gordon, I have so much drama in my class, especially with kids like you, that I don't really need to be on stage anymore." But I do think addressing these things directly is very important. And usually the person that was bullying was in a lot of pain, him or herself. So thank you so much for that question, Chris. It was the most painful thing for me as a teacher was when kids were mean to each other. But I loved a class clown. We needed that. I bet your teacher loved you, Chris. Hi, Grisha.
Hello, nice to see you. Thank you for your talk. And just to really appreciate the importance of humor. My family, I'm one of 6 kids, a big family, and everybody has a really like kind of sick and fun sense of humor. We laughed a lot, and we would tease my mom because she had a great sense of humor, but she didn't like it was too unladylike to be hysterical. And she was also very overweight, and she would start to jiggle and hold her belly and like try to compose herself, and we would just make her laugh harder and harder. But I also learned at an early age how to diffuse really intense feelings with humor. Like my dad was a World War II veteran, a prisoner of war. He was in the Bataan Death March and later in Japan in a Japanese prison camp. And he used humor to diffuse all that trauma. And he ended up getting really ill with a war-related disease. And when he got prognosis as death, in the he was in the elevator with a group of the family, and it was really heavy, and no one was saying anything. And he said, "Well, damn, if I had known that, I wouldn't have bought these new shoes." So it was like that. That's an example of really early, like, we can use humor to get through really intense stuff. And then just this morning, actually, the reason I'm not in person at GBF is I was waiting around for a FaceTime. I have a friend who is a longtime sober friend of mine who went through a really bad relapse and also ended up getting really ill and was in the hospital in an induced coma for 2 weeks.
Wow.
On a respirator. We weren't sure he was going to survive, and he was having psychotic episodes, and it was really bad. And he's back, like he just got off the ventilator and breathing on his own, and he's sitting up now. And for a long time, for the last week or so, he couldn't even operate the phone or move. And so he's back among us. And another sober friend went to visit him, and then they FaceTimed with me. And the first thing that he said, like, as he came out of that, was like, "Oh, girl, I really fell off my heels this time." It's like another, like, I always connected with gay, campy humor.
Mhm.
I feel like I have a complicated sense of humor. I've never watched Seinfeld or, I don't like that slapstick kind of stuff, but camp is there for me, and like absolutely fabulous when that series was out. So, anyway, just, so the first way we connected after he came out of that terrible, hellish 2 weeks of, psychosis and coma was, just falling off your high heels. So I don't know. I just appreciate it. Thank you for humor. Thank you for making us laugh today. I've been in a kind of a period of malaise, and so it's just good to get a few giggles in. And as you know, I teach kindergarten, so we giggle a lot all day long. All you have to do is say poop or underwear, and it's hysterical.
Tough crowd. Risha, tell us the name of your friend so we can hold him in our hearts.
Matthew, yeah.
Matthew.
Thank you.
Let's just take a moment to think of Matthew and send him healing energy. Grisha, you mentioned the men of World War II, and my dad never talked about his experience till he was dying. And I think of Josh Kornbluth's conversation with that neurologist, that I think, I know that people who survived the Holocaust or World War II soldiers, one of the ways they coped with it was to not talk about it. And it would have been so much more helpful for them if they could have talked about it. I'm glad your father opened up at the end of his life. What a wonderful comment about his shoes.
Actually, I forgot to mention briefly,
Yeah.
he and his brother both enlisted at the same time, and they were both in separate prison camps, but they were working on a book, and the title was "We Almost Died Laughing," about their experience in the war, but they never finished it, sadly, and the tapes are kind of lost. And anyway,
That's too bad. I would have liked to read that. Yeah. My dad had a wonderful sense of humor, and I was surprised when my brother and I were kind of midwifed my dad through his dying process, how much humor we found. I mean, and thank God for that, that we could laugh. I remember when my dad was in hospice, I leaned over him and I said, "Dad, would you like me to sing to you?" And he looked up at me and said, "No, thanks." Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much. I always enjoy your talks with the time you spent with us. The meditation that you gave and some of the comments you just made about Well, in the meditation, you talked about the different ways in which we use humor, sort of recognizing those. And it made me realize that that might be why humor is so welcome as a part of a eulogy. You know, it not only breaks the tension and all that, but I think it, you know, instead of just talking about somebody's accomplishments or something, is to sort of highlight the funny points in their life. And I think it sort of comforts people, you know. Do you have any reflections on, you know, using humor in dark times to
Thomas,
sort of relieve that tension?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I meant to say that in our Buddhist funerals, there's always a place for people to share something about the person who had died. And often it was something about, you know, when someone is dying or they have died, the things about them that irritated you so much become so wonderful. You know, you think of those little quirks with such affection. And there's always a place in a Buddhist funeral for people to share not just the wonderful virtues of that person, but their very human shortcomings or foibles. And there's a lot of laughter in Buddhist memorial services. And I think you're right. I think it's part of being human. I remember during one memorial service, a priest came into the room and shared the score of the Super Bowl that was going on at the same time during the memorial service, because the person who had died loved football. So there you go. Yeah, that's so important. Thank you for that, Thomas.
You know, I'll share the story that I told at my father's funeral. You know, we were part of this Catholic congregation, and my parents insisted that we always sit up front, which embarrassed us kids to no end, you know. And so we're there one day in the front row, and it's a hot summer day. There's this huge horsefly buzzing around the congregation, and you can tell where the horsefly is at any point because you see people waving and stuff like this, and it's making its way around. And the priest is up giving his sermon, and this thing lands on my dad's knee. And so he wads up this, you know, this paperback little pamphlet. And before he goes to hit it, it comes up and it lands on his forehead. And so he doesn't miss a beat. He still keeps the thing folded, and he moves up very slowly, and he's holding this pamphlet, and he whacks himself in the forehead. You know? And the priest is interrupted, and everybody stares at us. And, you know, I just wanted to crawl underneath the pew. But that was one of those things, like, looking back at it, you just had to laugh, you know. Absolutely.
That's wonderful. It reminds me, my dad was very irreverent, and we were in the Episcopal Church at the time. We tried a lot of different religions, but my dad was sitting in the congregation, and the minister was giving the sermon, and suddenly my dad calls out, "Hey, Dick, there's a spider on your vestment." And oh, thanks, Terry. He brushed it off, you know. Maybe I should have started our discussion with, heard any good jokes lately? Here's a good joke I'm going to end with. Well, this old fellow was at the Giants game, sitting in a really good seat, and there was an empty seat next to him. Well, there was this younger man up in the stands, and he saw this empty seat, and he had two thoughts. He thought, well, maybe that seat's available, and also I could provide some company to that old fella down there. So he goes down and he says to the older man, "Excuse me, but is this seat available?" And the old guy says, "Yeah, please have a seat. That's great." And the younger man said, "I'm surprised this seat is empty." And the older man turned to him and said, "You know, it's a sad thing, but my wife died recently, and she used to always accompany me to these games. And so I'm so glad you came down here to keep me company, because I'm remembering her so fondly, because we were always together at these Giants games." And the young man said, "Well, wasn't there someone from your family or one of your friends who could come with you today?" And the older guy goes, "Well, yeah, but they're all at the funeral." I don't usually remember jokes, but I love that one. Well, maybe we should call it a day. I'm not sure if you have the announcements, but I want to thank you all for your wonderful participation. And I always have fun with you guys, so thank you for inviting me. I'll come back sometime, I hope.